not the explanation. Not the consequences, not the full and terrible weight of what was being lost on that West Side Chicago street at 9:14 on a Tuesday morning in late October. Just the sound. The mechanical shriek of a tow truck winch engaging high and grinding and completely indifferent to what it was pulling away from the world. It was the sound of something ending that was not meant to end yet, and it cut through the cool morning air of West Madison Street, the way that kind of sound always does, without ceremony, without warning, without any acknowledgement that the thing being destroyed had taken 18 months of a man's life to build. A black man in a tan suit stood on the sidewalk with his hands hanging at his sides and watched the winch do its work. His left hand had risen once briefly to press against his shoulder, a small, involuntary gesture, the body registering something the face was not allowed to show, and then dropped again, and he stood very still, while the charger lurched forward onto the flatbed and the chains rattled, and the earpiece in his ear delivered nothing but static where 18 months of voices had been. A woman walking past with a stroller slowed down, looked at him, and kept walking, because Chicago is a city that has learned not to stop for other people's emergencies. A man on a bicycle swerved around the patrol car and did not look back. The city moved around him the way water moves around a stone, continuous, indifferent, carrying everything forward. 20 feet away, a young white officer in a mirror-polished uniform wrote on a citation pad with the focused satisfaction of a man completing a task he believes in. His chin lifted his boots, catching the October light in a way that suggested considerable effort had been invested in their appearance this morning. He did not look at the man on the sidewalk. He did not need to. As far as Officer Marcus Doyle was concerned, the situation had resolved itself exactly as he had known it would, because Marcus Doyle had been trained to know how situations resolved themselves, and he had never once in his short career been given a reason to question that training. He was still writing when the first black SUV came around the corner from the north. It did not come the way backup comes. The casual arrival of a colleague, the familiar wail of a CPD siren, the easy authority of someone who belongs here. It came fast, purposeful, coordinated, with 3 other vehicles materializing from 3 other directions, simultaneously boxing the intersection in 40 seconds with the geometric precision of something that had been planned long before this morning. And the officer who stepped out of the lead vehicle moved with the specific stride of a woman who was not here to explain herself to anyone. Marcus Doyle looked up from his citation pad. His pen stopped moving. The man in the tan suit watched from the sidewalk, his hand pressed again against his left shoulder, his face still arranged into the same controlled stillness it had worn for the past 40 minutes. He watched Doyle's face in the moment of understanding the sequence of it, the color leaving in stages, the pen frozen, the jaw going slack, and what he felt was not satisfaction and not vindication. What he felt was the specific bone-deep exhaustion of a man who has been right about something terrible and finds no comfort in it whatsoever. This is what 18 months looks like when it ends wrong, Darius Coleman thought. This is exactly what it looks like. Special Agent Darius Coleman had been someone else for so long that the ritual of being himself again each morning had taken on the weight of something precious. The kind of thing you handle carefully because you know from experience how easily it can be dropped. He was 41 years old, lean in the way of men who stay physically capable not for vanity, but because their work requires it. And on this particular Tuesday morning, he sat inside his modified Dodge Charger on West Madison Street with a 3rd cup of coffee cooling in the center console, and ran through his pre-operation checklist with the methodical calm of someone who has done dangerous things long enough that calm is no longer a performance but a settled condition of the nervous system. The tan suit he wore had cost $1,400 and had been chosen with deliberate precision, expensive enough to communicate success in the world he was navigating, understated enough to avoid the flash that drew attention from the wrong people, and treated with a surface coating that made it photograph poorly on security cameras, a detail that the FBI's technical division had insisted on, and that Coleman had initially found excessive and had since come to appreciate deeply. He wore it the way a craftsman wears a reliable tool because it worked, because it had worked for 18 months, and because today was the last day he would need it to. He reached up and tapped the navigation screen 3 times in the specific sequence that had become as automatic as breathing. The GPS dissolved, replaced by 3 audio waveform channels in clean parallel lines on the display. Channel 1. The main meeting room of the building across the street, where voices were settling into the focused, lowered register of men who were about to say things they only said to people they trusted completely. Channel 2. The hallway. Channel 3. The rear exit. The earpiece in his ear canal delivered it all in real time, feeding simultaneously to a listening post 4 miles east, where SAC Elena Vargas had been sitting since 6 a.m. with a team of analysts and a wall of monitors and 18 months of accumulated patience. Coleman exhaled slowly, deliberately, the way his Quantico breathing instructor had taught him a decade ago, when the concept had seemed unnecessary and he had since come to regard as foundational to staying alive, and let his heart rate settle into the range where he could think clearly and act precisely. The charger itself was a masterpiece of patient engineering custom suspension, reinforced to handle the weight of its hidden contents without betraying them through a telltale sag window tint, calibrated to the exact legal limit, because a shade darker would give a careful officer a legitimate reason to look twice. Door panels concealing directional microphones, trunk holding backup recording equipment, and a satellite uplink feeding data in real time to FBI servers. $2 million of technology inside the shell of a $40,000 streetcar built by technicians who understood that the best hiding place for something invaluable is inside something that looks like it belongs exactly where it is. He had been the man this car was built to support, ghost financial consultant specialist in moving money through channels that left no fingerprints for 18 months. The weight of those 18 months lived in him in specific places in the memories that surfaced at 3 a.m. with the clarity of things that actually happened, which they had, every one of them. He remembered the night Marcus Reaper Vance had pressed a gun to his forehead in the back room of a South Side restaurant, watching for the flinch that would tell him whether Ghost was worth trusting. Coleman had not flinched. He had smiled the slow, unhurried smile of a man who had driven across town in traffic and was not going to let a gun change the terms of the meeting, and had said that he had not come this far to have his time wasted over a misunderstanding, and that if Reaper wanted to do business or wanted to play games, he should pick one because Ghost's time cost money. The gun had lowered. The deal had gone through. Coleman had thrown up in a gas station bathroom 4 blocks away with his hands shaking so hard that the soap dispenser defeated him twice. He remembered the close call 6 months in when a low-level dealer with an inconveniently good memory thought he recognized Coleman from somewhere. A courthouse. A news report he couldn't quite place it, but kept returning to it with the specific squint of a man working at a puzzle. Coleman had spent 20 minutes constructing a story about a corporate twin, some FBI-looking suit, who shared his face and who was the reason Ghost stayed off social media, and had bought the dealer a drink and watched the suspicion dissolve into the warm bath of free alcohol and plausible explanation. The wire had kept recording. Coleman had driven home that night with his hands at 10 and 2, and the specific sensation of someone who has walked across thin ice and only understood how thin it was once they reached the other side. And now today. Today was the day all of it resolved. He rolled his left shoulder, twice an old injury from a training accident at Quantico, a torn rotator cuff that had never fully healed, that ached in cold weather and in moments of sustained stillness that he had learned to treat as a kind of internal clock marking the cost of things, and felt the familiar pull of it, the reminder that nothing comes free. He settled the shoulder. He turned his attention to the second-floor windows of the building across the street, where the voices in his earpiece were growing more specific, more purposeful, more like the final confirmation he had been building toward. Just a few more hours, he thought. Let them say it all on tape. And then this ends. He did not see the patrol car until its light bar hit his rearview mirror. The street saw Officer Marcus Doyle before Doyle saw the Charger. What the street saw was a CPD patrol cruiser moving with the deliberate proprietary crawl of a driver who was not responding to a call but hunting for one, the slow territorial patrol of a man who had decided that everything in his field of vision was potentially subject to his authority and was taking his time selecting which piece of it to exercise that authority upon. It moved past the shuttered corner store, past the laundromat with hand-painted hours on the window, past the small cluster of men drinking coffee outside a mechanic's shop, who tracked it with the practiced, weary attention of people who have been watched by that particular kind of slow cruiser for most of their adult lives. Inside the cruiser, Marcus Doyle was 26 years old, 5 months and 11 days into his career as a Chicago police officer, and had not made a single significant arrest. Not one. His father, Captain Harlan Doyle of the 15th District, had 30 years of decorated service, and a name that every veteran in CPD knew, and most of them respected a name Marcus had been trading on since his application to the academy and hating himself for trading on and could not seem to stop needing. He had graduated in the top quarter of his class. He had qualified expert on the range. He had done everything the metrics rewarded, and there was still nothing to show for 5 months of putting on the uniform except the uniform itself and the silence that filled the space where stories about real arrests should have been. He spotted the Charger at 9:03 a.m. through his binoculars parked in a no-parking zone on West Madison, and something in his chest tightened with the particular excitement of a man who believes he has finally found what he has been looking for. New model. Obsidian black with the kind of depth that absorbs light. Custom rims, window tint at the legal limit, the whole package communicating affluence in a register designed to impress a specific audience. Parked directly outside a building that Doyle's briefings had associated with the Disciples of Chaos, one of the most violent distribution networks operating on the West Side. The driver visible through the windshield, a black man in a suit, one hand on the wheel. The posture of someone entirely at ease in a place where, by Doyle's calculation, ease was impossible, without either belonging to something dangerous or being something dangerous. In this neighborhood, expensive means dirty. Doyle thought not as a question, not as a hypothesis he was testing, but as a fact of the world solid and reliable as concrete. The kind of truth that has been repeated often enough that it has stopped feeling like an opinion and started feeling like knowledge. He believed it the way you believe things that have been handed to you by people you trust before you had the framework to evaluate them completely without the small resistant catch of doubt that might have saved him. He had heard it from Sergeant Raymond Briggs, 22 years on the force in the break room of the 15th District. He had heard it stated not as prejudice, but as experience offered with the authority of a man whose survival on these streets seemed to confirm everything he said about them. And Doyle had absorbed it the way young officers absorb the wisdom of veterans they admire as foundation, not hypothesis, as fact, not opinion. But Doyle had also done something that Briggs had not taught him, something Doyle had constructed on his own from the materials of his own particular insecurity. 3 months ago, on his 3rd week on the job, he had stopped a black man driving a Lexus through Englewood at 11 p.m. The man had been polite, compliant, had produced his license and registration without hesitation, and explained calmly that he was a cardiologist returning from a late call at Rush University Medical Center. Doyle had written the stop as a lane violation. The lane violation had not occurred. Doyle had known, even as he wrote it, that it had not occurred. But Briggs, when Doyle told him about the stop the next morning, had nodded and said that his instincts were developing nicely, and Doyle had taken that approval and banked it like currency, and had tried not to think about the cardiologist's face when the stop paperwork arrived. He told himself he trusted his eyes. He did not tell himself what he had done with them when they conflicted with what his mind had already decided. He reached for his radio. He did not call Sergeant Briggs. He did not call his watch commander. He did not run the vehicle's plates through the federal database, which would have returned a result that would have ended this morning very differently. He called dispatch, requested a tow truck, and pulled his cruiser out of position with the settled confidence of a man following a principle he believes is correct. He said the thing aloud to no one the way you sometimes say things aloud when you want them to be more than thoughts. In this neighborhood, expensive means dirty, every single time. His physical signature was fixed by the time he got out of the cruiser, broad through the shoulders, clean-cut in a way that looked maintained rather than natural jaw set at the angle of a man who is always slightly performing for an audience that isn't quite there. His utility belt was arranged with the obsessive precision of someone who had practiced the arrangement so many times it had become a ritual. His boots, mirror-polished, caught the October light. He looked in the way of men who have studied what looking like a cop is supposed to look like, and have executed the study successfully like a recruiting poster, the kind that hangs in the academy hallway and does not include anything about what it costs to be wrong. He was thinking as he walked toward the Charger about the story he would tell at the precinct bar tonight. He was not thinking about federal jurisdictions, about covert operations, about why a surveillance-grade vehicle might be parked outside a cartel headquarters in a way that required a different explanation than the one he had already settled on. He was not capable in this moment of thinking about those things, because a man who has decided he knows exactly how something works has, in that deciding, closed the door on every piece of information that might require him to know it differently. He rapped his knuckles on the passenger window. Hard. The knock of someone who expects compliance. The window slid down. 1 hour before Marcus Doyle spotted the Charger, Sergeant Raymond Briggs was in the break room of the 15th District holding court over a cup of coffee that was mostly cream positioned in the chair at the head of the table, the way a man positions himself when he has decided that the chair at the head of the table is his by right. He was 48 years old. Heavy through the middle in the way of men who were once physically capable and stopped needing to be, with a face that had maintained a deep, permanent flush for so long that it had become less a symptom than a feature, the specific complexion of a man whose blood pressure had given up negotiating with him and simply settled into its own permanent arrangement. 22 years on the force. 14 excessive force complaints filed against him in those 22 years, and everyone buried by the Union, by internal affairs, by the slow institutional gravity that protects men who know where the paperwork goes and who signs what. He carried those buried complaints the way some men carry commendations as proof of having done things and having not been stopped, which in the culture Briggs lived inside was its own form of distinction. He was not a stupid man. That mattered. Stupid men were easy to dismiss. The damage they caused was comprehensible. Briggs was intelligent in the specific way of men who have navigated complex institutions for a long time without ever being held accountable for the navigation, good at reading people, skilled at managing up, expert at constructing the kind of paper trail that made bad decisions look like reasonable ones in hindsight. What he had never developed in 22 years of being consequential enough to be feared and protected enough to be careless was any curiosity about whether the things he believed were actually true or whether the results of his philosophy measured honestly pointed somewhere he did not want to go. He was not going to develop it this morning. "You want to know how this actually works?" Briggs said, leaning forward on the table with the relaxed authority of a man saying something important, and knowing it, his eyes on Doyle, specifically the student he had decided was the most worth shaping. There were 3 rookies in the room. Briggs spoke to all of them, but looked at one. Not the manual version. The real version. He paused for effect because he had learned that pauses built authority and that authority built compliance. "Out there on those streets you have one instrument worth trusting," Briggs continued, "and that instrument is your eyes. Everything else, the training, the community engagement seminars, the constitutional law, refreshers, they make you sit through. That's for the paperwork and the lawyers. The real work happens in the first 3 seconds, when you look at something and your gut tells you what you're looking at. A man in a 6-figure car parked in the middle of a neighborhood where the median income is $23,000. What are your eyes telling you?" "That something doesn't add up," Doyle said. "That something doesn't add up," Briggs confirmed, nodding with the satisfaction of a man whose students understand him without needing things explained twice. "You trust that. You act on that. You don't stand there wondering if you might be missing something because the thing you think you might be missing is almost always the story the guy in the fancy car is trying to sell you." He picked up his coffee. "Your eyes don't lie to you. Remember that." And then, looking directly at Doyle with the particular warmth of a mentor passing down something valuable. "You want to know how this works, kid? You trust your eyes. Not their words, not their lawyers, your eyes. And your eyes don't lie." Doyle did not write it down. He did not need to. It settled into him the way things settle when they confirm what you already wanted to believe cleanly, completely, without the friction of doubt. What Briggs did not say in the break room that morning was the thing the evidence of his own career would have forced him to acknowledge if he had ever looked at it honestly, that the arrests he was proudest of had a pattern, and the pattern was not guilt, but appearance. That the stops he had made under the banner of instinct had a pattern too, and the pattern was not behavior, but skin. That the gap between "my eyes don't lie" and "I see what I want to see" was a gap that Briggs had been straddling for 22 years without ever naming it, because naming it would have required him to reckon with what he had done to people who had done nothing. He did not name it. He finished his coffee. He sent his rookies to their patrol assignments. He watched Marcus Doyle walk out of the break room with the satisfied expression of a man who has just given a gift, who believes that what he has handed down is wisdom rather than damage, who has no way of knowing because he has never asked what his gifts cost the people who receive them. He had prepared Marcus Doyle for exactly one thing. He just did not know yet what that preparation was going to cost. At 9:03 a.m., the earpiece delivered what 18 months of dangerous and costly work had been building toward Marcus Reaper Vance's voice, clear and specific and incriminating in the way of a man who trusts the room he is in, completely laying out a distribution route through Indianapolis with the matter-of-fact precision of someone discussing logistics, rather than poison naming a supplier figure of $12 million in first-quarter product, and then the detail Coleman had been circling for 6 months without being able to confirm the name of the Mexican supplier spoken aloud in a room whose audio was uploading in real time to FBI servers 4 miles east. The name spoken in Reaper's voice on federal record was worth more than everything Coleman had risked to reach this morning. His phone buzzed once against the center console. He picked it up without looking away from the second-floor windows across the street. The text was from SAC Elena Vargas. All teams in position, green across the board. 1 more hour. Coleman typed back with one thumb. Copy. It's happening. He set the phone down and let himself for one careful moment feel what 1 more hour meant. The end of being ghost. The end of sleeping with one eye open, the end of the specific exhaustion of being someone else so thoroughly and for so long that the distance between yourself and the character has narrowed to a line you can't always find in the dark. He had not planned carefully for what came after. He had been superstitious about it the way athletes are superstitious about counting points before the game ends. He would plan after. He would figure out who he was when he wasn't Ghost after. He reached into the hidden armrest compartment and opened it. Inside, wrapped in microfiber, were his real FBI credentials shield and ID card, his own face, looking back from the photo. Special Agent Darius Coleman, Federal Bureau of Investigation. He had not been able to carry them on his person for a year and a half because the moment a cartel enforcer found federal credentials in his pocket was the moment his life ended. The car was the only safe place. He looked at the photo for 3 seconds. Then he closed the compartment, felt it click shut, and turned his attention back to the windows. Through the earpiece, more voices, more detail, the meeting moving toward confirmation. Reaper walking through the payment structure. Diego Blade Ruiz confirming the East Side distribution split. Terrence Cash Monroe asking about the timing of the first transfer. All of it going to tape. All of it building toward the coordinated sweep that Vargas had been preparing for 6 months. 1 more hour, Coleman thought. Just let them say it all. The blue and red flash in his rear-view mirror hit him like a hand pressed flat against his chest. His eyes went to the mirror and found the patrol car 20 feet back, light bar cycling, and his mind ran through the implications in the time it takes most people to blink. His hands found the steering wheel. His earpiece continued to deliver Reaper's voice, oblivious and incriminating, while behind him, a young white officer stepped out of a patrol car and started walking toward the Charger with the stride of a man who has already made his decision. No, Coleman thought. Not now. Not today. He allowed himself that one thought. Then he shut it down because the operational reality did not care about not now, and the only available response to the operational reality was to manage it as precisely as possible for as long as possible, and hope that the training held long enough for the situation to resolve itself before everything came apart. He opened his door and stepped out with his hands visible, his posture open, every movement communicating non-threat as clearly as he knew how, which after 18 months of communicating things with his body that his mind was not feeling was very clearly indeed. The officer's name tag read Doyle. He looked young, mid-20s, with the coiled, eager intensity of someone who had something to prove and had just decided this was the moment to prove it. Coleman felt his stomach drop. Rookie, he thought. Of course it's a rookie. Coleman's threat assessment happened in the space between one breath and the next, running through scenarios with the efficiency of a system, refined under conditions where being slow to reach a conclusion meant being dead before you reached it. He could not turn off the wire, killing the audio feed would register as an anomaly at the listening post and trigger a response that would draw exactly the attention that would scatter the meeting before it delivered what they needed. He could not leave the car. The surveillance equipment was live and the credentials were in the hidden compartment, and an unattended federal vehicle in proximity to active cartel leadership was a liability with a very short fuse. He could not escalate, could not create a scene that would bring eyes from the second-floor windows of the building across the street. And he absolutely could not identify himself explicitly because the lookouts up there were watching this street with the patient, paranoid attention of men whose survival depended on noticing things. And Ghost, pulling FBI credentials from his shirt pocket, would be noted and transmitted and acted upon before Coleman could explain himself to anyone. The options resolved to 1. Perform calm, speak carefully, buy enough time for this young officer to either listen or call someone who would make him listen. Coleman stepped out with his hands visible. He arranged his body language into the deliberate openness of a man who is in an inconvenient situation and intends to resolve it through conversation. He took his position beside the car, not too close to the door, not too far, and turned to face Doyle with the measured professional neutrality he had been practicing for 18 months in rooms considerably more dangerous than this sidewalk. "License and registration," Doyle said before Coleman could speak, and his voice carried the flat certainty of someone who has already written the first paragraph of the story. "Officer," Coleman said, keeping his voice level, "I understand this looks unusual. I'm going to need you to contact your watch commander before we—" "It looks like you think the rules don't apply to you," Doyle cut in. His hand rested near his belt in a way that was not quite threatening but was designed to be noticed. "You're in a no-parking zone. In Coleman's earpiece, voices from across the street, still detailed, still moving, and then a new voice, sharper. "Yo, we got police outside." Another, "Where are? Right out front. Cops lit up. Ghosts talking to them." Coleman kept his face neutral. He kept his breathing even. He watched Doyle begin to circle the charger with the slow, proprietary inspection of a man confirming what he has already decided, running his eyes over the custom rims, crouching to look at the suspension trailing his fingers along the door panel. "Nice car for this neighborhood," Doyle said, straightening. His tone had shifted from official to something with a sharper edge. And then he said it flat and certain, the way you say something you believe is a fact of nature rather than an opinion you've never tested. "In this neighborhood, expensive means dirty, every single time." He said it without embarrassment. He said it to a black man standing on a Chicago sidewalk wearing a suit that cost more than Doyle's monthly salary, in the same tone he might use to describe the weather, as though the sentence were simply true, as though it described the world, rather than revealing something about the person speaking it. And Coleman heard it with the specific bone-deep exhaustion of a man who has heard this particular shape of thinking in 100 different forms in 100 different rooms for his entire adult life. The exhaustion of someone for whom this is not a philosophical position to be debated, but a condition of existence to be survived. He did not let any of it reach his face. He could not afford to. From the earpiece, Reaper's voice cold and flat now. "Ghost better not be bringing heat to this meeting. If he's with them," another voice, "look at him. He's calm. Probably just a parking thing." Reaper, "Probably, but if it's not, we're done. Stay ready to move." 18 months, balanced on the edge of a knife. And the knife was 26 years old and had something to prove. Coleman made his first request. He asked Doyle to call his watch commander. He asked it calmly, professionally, in the voice of a man making a reasonable request rather than a desperate one, because desperate requests from men in expensive cars in this neighborhood, according to Doyle's operating theory, confirmed exactly what Doyle suspected. Doyle dismissed it. He said he did not need his commander for a traffic stop. He said it with the specific confidence of someone who has been told by people he trusts that his judgment is sound. Coleman made his second request. He asked Doyle to run his name, not just his license, his full name, through the federal database. He explained that a license check through the local system and a federal database check were different things and would return different results. Doyle dismissed this too. He said the license had come back clean, and that clean was suspicious in a neighborhood like this, and that Coleman should step away from the vehicle. Coleman made his third request. He provided a phone number, a direct line, to the Chicago FBI field office and explained as plainly as he was able while maintaining the cover that 3 people's lives depended on that one call to that number would clarify everything. Doyle looked at the phone number. He looked at Coleman. And his expression in that moment was the expression of a man who has been offered a door and has decided the door is a trap, because men who are lying offer doors that look like exits and only lead deeper into the maze. He had been taught this. He believed it. He was applying it now. "Stop asking me to call someone," Doyle said. "I know exactly how this works." He said it with the patient firmness of a man explaining something to someone who is slow to understand. "You want time for your lawyer or your people to show up? I've been doing this my whole life. 5 months on the force, his whole life." In Coleman's earpiece, "Deals off, everybody out the back, move." The voices of the meeting scattered, overlapping, urgent, the specific sound of men executing a practiced withdrawal, and then Channel 1 went quiet, and then Channel 2, and then Channel 3. The waveforms on the navigation screen behind the tinted glass of the charger collapsed one after another into flat lines. Coleman stood on the sidewalk and heard 18 months of work evaporate channel by channel in the space of 40 seconds. He kept his face blank. He kept his hands visible. He said nothing because there was nothing left to say that would change what was already in motion. Doyle reached for his radio. What followed was not a confrontation in any dramatic sense. Confrontation requires 2 people willing to raise their voices, and Coleman was not willing to raise his. And the cost of that discipline of maintaining the surface while everything beneath it was coming apart was a thing he would be paying for long after this morning. Doyle escalated methodically, each increment small enough to seem measured in isolation and large enough in aggregate to constitute sustained pressure, the kind of pressure Briggs had taught him to apply and maintain until the person on the other end of it broke or bolted or gave him something he could use. He circled the car again. He questioned Coleman's income in a tone that made the question sound like an accusation. He noted pointedly that the neighborhood was the kind of place where expensive things did not appear without explanation, and that the explanation Coleman had provided, financial consulting, was the kind of answer that sounded prepared rather than true. Coleman gave him nothing. He kept his hands visible. He kept his voice at the same measured register he had maintained for 18 months in rooms with considerably higher stakes than this sidewalk, and he answered each escalation with the patience of someone who understood that patience was the only remaining tool available to him. And then Doyle put his hand on Coleman's left shoulder. It was not the kind of contact that would appear dramatic in a police report. It was the guiding touch of an officer moving a subject away from a vehicle for inspection. The kind of thing that happens on stops every day in every city. The kind of thing that reads as routine unless you are the person whose shoulder it lands on. But Doyle's hand came down with more force than the moment required. The excess pressure of a man who is accustomed to compliance and is not fully conscious of the gap between the force he uses and the force the situation calls for. And Coleman's old Quantico injury fired immediately, the torn rotator cuff that had never fully healed, sending a sharp specific pain traveling from the joint down through his arm in a way that was both familiar and entirely unwelcome. Coleman did not react. He had been trained not to react under conditions considerably more difficult than this, and the training held. But the pain was there, documented in his body, with the precision that only nerve endings can achieve, and it would be there when he needed to account for it. He stepped away from the car as instructed. He asked one more time for probable cause. Doyle said, "Vehicle modifications, nervous behavior." Coleman said, "I'm not nervous." Doyle said, "You're too calm, that's suspicious." And Coleman looked at him, really looked for the first time since this began past the performance of patience and into the actual situation, and understood with complete and terrible clarity that this was not an argument he could win, because it was not structured as an argument. It was structured as a conclusion in search of justification. Calm was evidence of guilt. Cooperation was evidence of guilt. Asking for verification was evidence of guilt. Every piece of data that contradicted the conclusion would be reframed as additional confirmation of it, because that is what conclusions do when they have been promoted to facts before they have been tested. They become immune to evidence. Doyle had not arrived at "in this neighborhood expensive means dirty" by looking at the evidence. He had arrived at it before the evidence existed, and he was now moving through the evidence with the certainty of a man who already knows what he is going to find. In the earpiece, Reaper's voice, distant now, already in a vehicle. "Ghost is either the dumbest rat we ever had, or he's legitimate and just got incredibly unlucky. Either way, he's burned. We don't use his routes again." Coleman closed his eyes for exactly half a second. Then he opened them because closing them was not available to him, because there was still something to save here, even if it was not the operation, and saving what remained required his eyes to be open and his mind to be clear and his voice to continue at the same measured register that had carried him through 18 months of rooms full of men who would have killed him if he had given them a reason. "Officer Doyle," he said. And his voice was very quiet now, stripped of every layer of performance down to the plain and unadorned truth of a man saying the last honest thing available to him. "I'm going to say this once more, and I need you to actually hear it. That vehicle is not what you think it is. I am not who you think I am. And if you tow that car, you will set off a chain of events that will end very badly for both of us. I am not threatening you.
I am telling you the truth, and I am telling you that you still have time to verify it before the time runs out."
Doyle looked at him. He looked at him with the specific expression of a man who has been offered a lifeline and has decided the lifeline is a trap, because that is what he has been taught, and what he has been taught has been presented to him as the distillation of experience, rather than the inheritance of someone else's bias, and he cannot tell the difference because he has never been given a reason to look for one. "Nice try," Doyle said, and reached for his radio. From the earpiece, Vargas's voice controlled urgent, the voice of someone managing a crisis and not quite winning.
"Ghost. Ghost, talk to me. We are losing participants. What is happening out there?" Coleman could hear her. He could not answer. Doyle was 3 feet away, radio in hand, and the cartel lookouts were still at the windows.
He stood on the sidewalk of West Madison Street and listened to SAC Vargas say his name 3 times and could not respond to any of them. And what he felt was not anger. Anger was a luxury he had not had time for in 18 months, but something closer to grief. The specific grief of a man watching something he has built very carefully be dismantled very carelessly by someone who does not understand what they are holding. Doyle called dispatch. He requested a tow truck. He gave the address. He clipped the radio back to his belt with the practiced motion of a man completing a procedure. "Do not tow this vehicle," Coleman said, and for the first time the urgency broke through the surface of his voice, not desperation, but the stripped-down clarity of a man who has run out of diplomatic options and is simply stating a fact. "I am begging you. 1 phone call to your supervisor. That is all I am asking." "You don't give me orders," Doyle said, and then, almost as an afterthought, with the mild satisfaction of a man who has managed a situation correctly and is moving toward its resolution, "You're free to go once the paperwork is done." Coleman looked at him for a long moment. He looked at the face still wearing its satisfied proprietary expression, the face of a man who believes the situation has concluded in the way he intended. Who does not yet understand that conclusion and consequence are different things, and that the consequences of this morning have not yet begun. "You're going to remember this day for the rest of your life," Coleman said quietly. "I promise you that." Doyle smirked. "Yeah, the day I took down a drug dealer in a suit." Coleman said nothing more. There was nothing more to say. He turned. He faced north. He waited. Coleman watched Doyle reach for the radio, the way you watch something fall. The arc visible, the impact inevitable. The window between seeing it and stopping it just wide enough to make the seeing unbearable. "Dispatch Unit 23, Doyle said with the brisk confidence of a man filing a routine report. "I need a tow truck at West Madison and South Kesey. Suspicious vehicle driver uncooperative." Coleman said, "Do not tow this vehicle." Doyle said, "You don't give me orders," and clipped the radio back to his belt. "Step back. Vehicles being impounded. 4 miles east." SAC Vargas was watching audio waveforms collapse on her monitoring wall. One screen going dark, then another. Then all of them simultaneously, and maintaining the kind of control over her voice that required something she would not have access to until this was over. Field Coordinator Agent Priya Ose called the status in flat professional tones because the situation required someone to be flat and professional about it. Santos offline. Monroe offline. They're scattering. All participants. Vargas into her headset. "Ghost, Ghost. I need your status. Darius, talk to me." Coleman heard her. He could not answer. Earl Pruitt arrived with the particular inevitability of things you have seen coming and been unable to stop. He was a thick-bodied man in his 50s in a grease-stained work shirt, 27 years of towing behind him, and the sixth sense that comes from 2.5 decades of being the last stop before the impound lot. He climbed out of the cab and walked around the Charger. Once slowly, his experienced eyes taking inventory, reinforced wheel wells, suspension carrying weight. It shouldn't need to carry if this were just a streetcar window, tint at the exact legal limit. not a shade over complete absence of exterior personalization. No dealer badge, no bumper stickers, none of the small accumulated marks of a life lived in a vehicle. Earl crouched and looked at the undercarriage. He stood up. He walked over to Doyle.
"Hey, officer." His tone was careful, the tone of a man about to say something he knows is probably going to complicate his morning.
"This car looks federal to me. Government-grade suspension on the rear axle. You real sure about this?" Doyle, not looking up from his citation pad, hooked it up. Earl looked at Coleman. Coleman stood on the sidewalk with his hands at his sides and gave Earl nothing, could not afford to give Earl anything because the lookout windows were still across the street, and whatever remained of this operation depended on Ghost's cover holding for whatever time was left. Earl held Coleman's look for 2 full seconds. He had been doing this job long enough to know the difference between a man who had lost his car and a man who had lost something much larger than a car, and what he was looking at was the second kind, unambiguously, in a way that was making him deeply uncomfortable. But the officer had given the order. Earl shrugged and went to work. "I can give you a phone number." Coleman said, his words coming faster now. Not because he had lost control, but because the window was still technically open, and open windows, even small ones, were worth using. "A direct line to—" "Step back from the vehicle, Mr. Coleman," Doyle said, and the dismissal in his voice had the quality of a door closing. "Last warning." Coleman stepped back. He looked at the tow truck. He looked at Earl, connecting the chains to the Charger's frame with practiced efficiency, the metal links rattling against the steel hook in the cool morning air. He looked at Doyle's citation pad, the pen moving with the focused satisfaction of a man executing a plan. He reached up and touched his left shoulder. Very briefly, the old injury still throbbing from Doyle's hand, the body keeping its own record of the morning's events, filing what the mind could not afford to process right now into the precise and unforgetting archive of nerve endings and muscle memory. He filed it there. He would need it later. He pulled out his phone. He dialed. 2 rings. Vargas answered sharp and commanding, even through the phone's small speaker. The voice of someone who has been waiting for this call and is managing very precisely the gap between waiting and panic. Darius status. S.A.C. Vargas. Coleman said, his eyes fixed on Doyle's face, watching it with the careful attention of someone who needs to know the exact moment understanding arrives. "I'm on West Madison with a CPD officer who just impounded my vehicle and refused multiple verification requests. We have a situation." A pause. Brief. Then Vargas, and her voice had gone to a temperature Coleman recognized as the coldest register she possessed. "Put him on the phone." Coleman held the phone out to Doyle. Doyle looked at it. He did not take it. Vargas's voice came through the speaker into the open air. "Officer, this is Special Agent in Charge Elena Vargas, FBI, Chicago Field Office. If you do not take this phone, you will compound a federal felony with deliberate obstruction of justice. Take the phone." Doyle stared at it, did not move. Coleman pocketed the phone. He looked north up the street where the traffic moved with the indifferent rhythm of a city that did not know what was coming. "You have about 12 minutes, he said. "Doyle, until what?" Coleman did not answer. He simply faced north and waited because waiting was the only thing left, and because he knew with absolute certainty that the 12 minutes would answer the question without any further help from him. The winch engaged with a mechanical groan that rose in pitch as the chain went from slack to taut to straining, and the Charger lurched forward 6 inches with a jolt that was angular and sharp, in a way that the reinforced suspension had been engineered to handle during motion but had not been designed for, because no one who built a $2 million surveillance vehicle inside the shell of a modified streetcar had planned for a 26-year-old rookie cop who needed to make an arrest. Inside the car, the physics were precise and unforgiving. The ribbon cable connecting the primary recording array to the satellite uplink pulled free from its housing, not dramatically, just with the quiet finality of a connection that had reached the end of its tolerance and given way. A backup battery compartment popped open in the trunk, spilling lithium cells onto the cargo floor, where they rolled against each other, with small clicking sounds that no one outside the car could hear. The circuit boards managing the audio channels had been calibrated to absorb road vibration within a specific frequency range. The jolt of the flatbed was outside that range, and the boards did not absorb it so much as register it as a terminal event and shut down. Across all three channels, the meeting room, the hallway, the rear exit, the waveforms that had been running for 3 hours collapsed into flat lines in the same moment simultaneously, completely. In Coleman's earpiece, one sharp burst of static like a word cut off in the first syllable of its first sound, and then silence. Not the silence of a quiet room. The silence of a channel that has nothing left to transmit absolute immediate, carrying the specific weight of something that cannot be restarted from this end. 4 miles east, every screen in the FBI listening post went black simultaneously. The tech analyst's voice rising above its professional baseline for the first time all morning. "We've lost him. All feeds are down. Ghost is completely offline." Vargas grabbed her headset. She said Coleman's name. She said it again. She said it a third time with something in her voice that she was managing very carefully, and that her team could hear anyway, because you cannot fully conceal the sound of a person losing something they have been building for 18 months. Agent Osei began running through field team positions and options, and what remained of the situation's salvageability, which was not much, and was diminishing with every second that the cartel leadership was moving away from that building. From the second-floor windows across the street, a lookout watched the tow truck do its work and sent a text to a number that lived in a phone 3 blocks away in the back seat of a stolen Escalade in the hands of a man who had survived 12 years of federal investigation by treating paranoia as a professional discipline. Reaper Vance read the text. He made one call which went to 6 phones simultaneously, and what he said was 4 sentences that dissolved 18 months of federal work in the time it takes to speak them. "Close everything down, every location, every stash house, every contact point. If Ghost touched it, it's dead. We go dark." The network went dark. Coleman stood on the sidewalk of West Madison Street and watched the Charger rise onto the flatbed, and what he was watching was not just a car being towed. It was 18 months of careful and dangerous work, riding away on a flatbed, chained and helpless, driven by a man who had done his job and was going to get paid for it, while the man who had spent a year and a half building what the car contained stood on the sidewalk with his hands at his sides, and his shoulder aching and his earpiece delivering nothing but silence where voices used to be. His FBI credentials were in that car, locked in the hidden compartment in the armrest, the one that would take a bolt cutter and 20 minutes to locate. His real identity, the face in the photo, the shield, the name that was his rather than Ghost's, was in that car riding away. And the man left on the sidewalk was in a way that was not metaphorical, but operational temporarily without a self that he could show to anyone. Doyle walked over. He was writing on the citation pad. He was writing Coleman a parking ticket. Coleman looked at him, at the face still wearing its satisfied proprietary expression, the expression of a man who has caught something and has not yet understood that the trap has teeth that point in both directions. He looked at this young officer who had no idea what he had just done, who was going to spend years understanding it, who would carry the understanding longer than any sentence a judge could give him. "No," Coleman said quietly in response to Doyle's statement that he was free to go. "I'm not, and neither are you." Doyle, finally looking up, "Is that a threat?" "It's a prediction," Coleman said. And then, because there was nothing else, because the 12 minutes were running, because the only remaining thing he could do was be very precise about the record. In about 12 minutes, 4 black SUVs are going to turn onto this street. Federal agents are going to exit those vehicles and ask you very specific questions about why you towed an FBI surveillance vehicle in the middle of an active operation. When that happens, and I need you to hear me clearly, I want you to remember that I gave you every available opportunity to verify. I asked you to call your supervisor. I asked you to run my name through federal channels. I provided a direct phone number to the field office. I begged you. I begged you and you told me you knew exactly how this works. He looked at Doyle steadily. Remember this moment. When those vehicles arrive, I want you to remember it. Doyle shook his head. The smirk, reliable throughout, returned. Nice try, he said. Coleman said nothing. He turned. He faced north. He stood on the sidewalk of West Madison Street in a tan suit that cost $1,400 and waited with the patience of a man who has no remaining options for the 12 minutes to end. Coleman held the phone out one more time, and when Doyle still did not take it, he made the call himself on speaker in the open air of West Madison Street, because what mattered now was not the operation which was gone, but the record, and the record needed a witness. The line rang twice. Vargas picked up immediately, sharp and commanding even through the phone's small speaker. Darius, status. S.A.C. Vargas. Coleman set his eyes on Doyle's face, watching it with the clinical precision of a man documenting a reaction. I'm standing on West Madison with a CPD officer who has impounded my vehicle despite multiple requests for supervisor verification. We have a situation. Brief pause. Then Vargas and her voice had gone to its coldest register. Put him on the phone. Coleman held the phone toward Doyle, arm extended. Doyle looked at it. His smirk had developed a hairline fracture, something moving beneath a confidence not quite understanding but adjacent to it, the first stirring of a doubt that had not been allowed to exist until this moment. He did not take the phone. Vargas's voice came through the speaker into the October air. Officer, this is Special Agent in Charge Elena Vargas, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Chicago Field Office. You will take this phone or you will compound a federal felony with deliberate obstruction of justice. Take the phone. Doyle stared at it. Something moved across his face, a flicker quickly suppressed of the thing that was going to expand into terror in approximately 11 minutes. He had been taught that this was the move, the claim of authority, the name drop, the federal-sounding credential designed to spook a cop into backing off. He had been taught to recognize it and not be spooked by it. He applied what he had been taught. He did not take the phone. Coleman pocketed it. He looked north up the length of West Madison Street, where the traffic moved with the generous indifference of a city that did not know what was coming. You have about 12 minutes, he said. Doyle, until what? Coleman said nothing. What was coming would answer the question without any help from him, and what was coming was already in motion, already turning onto West Madison from 4 different directions, already coordinated and inevitable in the way of things that have been planned carefully and deployed precisely. He faced north. He waited. Earl Pruitt secured the last of the chains on the Charger and climbed into his cab without looking at either of them again. He had been towing cars for 27 years, and he had never in those 27 years felt as uncomfortable about a tow as he felt about this one, and he was going to spend a significant portion of the drive to the impound lot, telling himself that he had asked the question and the officer had given the order, and his responsibility ended there. He would not entirely succeed. Doyle went back to his cruiser. He sat behind the wheel, writing on his citation pad, occasionally looking up through the windshield at Coleman with an expression that had shifted almost without Doyle noticing the shift from satisfied certainty to something less comfortable and less settled. Something that contained around its edges the faintest outline of the thing that was going to dominate his face for the rest of his life. Coleman stood on the sidewalk. He was very still. Then he heard it. Not a CPD siren. He knew those by feel now, knew their pitch and rhythm the way you know the sound of a city you have lived in for a decade. This was different, higher, sharper, the specific electronic frequency of federal emergency equipment designed to cut through urban noise with a precision that CPD sirens didn't need, because CPD sirens didn't have to announce themselves to people who were already expecting something. Doyle heard it too. He looked up from the citation pad. He frowned, reaching for an explanation that would make the sound familiar and therefore manageable. The first black Chevy Suburban came around the corner from the north. It was moving fast and purposeful. and the sight of it was Coleman watched Doyle's face as it registered the first thing all morning that Doyle had not had a prepared explanation for. The second Suburban came from the south, the third and fourth from the west, and the intersection boxed itself in 40 seconds with a geometric precision that said clearly to anyone watching that this had been planned well before this morning, that these vehicles knew this intersection, that their positioning was the result of coordination rather than coincidence. Doyle's pen stopped moving. His citation pad rested on his knee, half-finished the parking ticket for a car that was not a car going nowhere useful. Coleman turned and watched the doors open. The doors opened in unison, not the staggered individual opening of people getting out of vehicles, but the coordinated deployment of people executing a plan that had been rehearsed, and 8 federal agents poured out with tactical vests bearing FBI in yellow letters across the chest, and back weapons drawn and held low ready moving with the fluid precision of a team that had done this or something very like it enough times that individual judgment had been largely replaced by coordinated response. Layer 1. The body responds before the brain. Doyle was already out of his cruiser, stepping onto the sidewalk with the trained reflex of an officer who hears sirens and moves toward them. His right hand drifted toward his service weapon, not to draw just the muscle memory of a man reaching for the familiar weight of the thing that has made him feel capable, and 8 federal weapons snapped up in perfect, terrible unison. "Hands away from your weapon!" 3 voices perfectly synchronized, saying the same thing at the same time, in a way that removed any ambiguity about the instruction. Doyle's hand jerked away. Both hands went up, fingers spread wide, and the cold that moved through him in that moment was not temperature but the specific cold of a man whose confidence has been surgically removed in the space of a single second. He froze. He stood in the October morning air with his hands up and his citation pad on the ground where he had dropped it, and the parking ticket he had been writing fluttering in the wind toward the storm drain, and his body was doing what trained bodies do under sudden, overwhelming pressure, following instructions without processing them. Layer 2. The alchemy of memory. The badge in the hidden compartment. The tan suit. The phone on speaker with the voice that said FBI Chicago Field Office. The request to call the supervisor, multiple requests, starting from the very beginning of the stop before Coleman had even produced his license. The phone number Coleman had offered. The way Coleman had stood on the sidewalk while the Charger was loaded onto the flatbed, completely still with something on his face that Doyle had read as arrogance and was now with the 8 weapons still pointed in his general direction. Understanding was not arrogance at all. In this neighborhood, expensive means dirty. The sentence arrived in Doyle's mind the way sentences arrive when they have been true for so long that you have stopped questioning them. And for the first time in 5 months and 11 days, on the force, he heard it from outside, rather than inside himself heard it, the way the person it was said to must have heard it, and felt something shift in his chest that was going to take him a very long time to name. Layer 3. The look. S. A.C. Elena Vargas emerged from the lead Suburban last moving with the purposeful stride of someone who does not need to announce herself in a Navy FBI windbreaker over a white shirt, her expression carrying the clinical assessment of a woman who has managed a great deal of complexity for a very long time and has allocated precisely the amount of her attention this situation requires. She walked directly to Doyle. She stopped in front of him with the composed, total authority of someone who has not raised her voice in a professional context in years because she has never needed to. She looked at him for 3 full seconds, not with anger, not with contempt, with the specific, devastating look of someone who has measured something and found it to be exactly as inadequate as she suspected. Then she gestured for his hands to come down and walked past him toward Coleman. Vargas reached Coleman, and her expression shifted marginally, the shift of someone moving from the source of the problem toward the casualty of it. "Agent Coleman, status." Coleman met her eyes. For the first time in 18 months, he did not have to calculate his response. Wire disconnected when they towed the vehicle. Operation is blown. Primary subjects are in the wind, Vance, Ruiz, Monroe, all of them. He reached up, pulled his shirt collar aside, lifted the thin chain from around his neck, the chain he had worn against his skin under Ghost's suits for a year and a half, the only place the credentials had been safe during 18 months of being someone other than himself. He opened the case. The shield caught the October light. The photo, his face clean-cut and official. Special Agent Darius Coleman, Federal Bureau of Investigation. And behind him, Doyle stared at it with the color leaving his face in a sequence. Cheeks first, then the jaw, then the line of his mouth, and the sequence was slow enough that every step of it was visible, every stage of the understanding, arriving and landing and taking something with it on the way in. The tan suit, the expensive car, the calm on his face that Doyle had read as the arrogance of a criminal who believed he was untouchable. I know exactly how this works. The sentence he had said to a federal agent who had spent 18 months in rooms where the wrong sentence got you killed, and who had stood on a Chicago sidewalk and asked 6 times for one phone call. Doyle's hands were trembling. He was not aware of them yet. Vargas's questioning of Doyle was methodical and quiet, which made it worse in the specific way that precise, unhurried dismantling is always worse than anger. Because anger gives you something to brace against, and precision gives you nothing but the truth, arriving at its own pace without mercy and without drama. "Did this agent ask you to call your supervisor?" Doyle's voice had been stripped of its morning confidence, carrying now the thin quality of something trying to maintain a shape that is no longer supported by anything beneath it. "Yes." "Did he ask you to verify his identity through federal channels, not just his license through the local system, but his name through federal databases?" "He said to run his name through the database." "Did you?" A pause. "I ran his license." "His license," Vargas said, with the flat evenness of someone correcting a factual error rather than making a moral judgment. "Through a local traffic system, not through federal channels, not through the channels he specifically requested." She looked at him steadily. "When the license came back clean, you decided that was suspicious. Is that accurate?" Doyle said nothing. The silence was its own answer. Vargas reached into the folder Agent Osei had handed her, the body cam transcript time-stamped, and formatted every word of the stop recorded by the camera on Doyle's own chest, the camera that had been running, because Doyle had been too certain of what he was doing to think about what it was recording. She held it in a way that communicated she was about to read from it. "Officer Doyle," she said, "on the morning of October 14th, you told Agent Coleman, and I am reading directly from your own body camera recording. In this neighborhood, expensive means dirty every single time." She looked up from the transcript. "You said this twice during the stop. Once, apparently, as an internal observation, and once directly to Agent Coleman as he stood on this sidewalk." She paused. "Is that accurate?" Doyle's jaw worked. Nothing came out. "And when he continued to request verification multiple times in multiple forms, you told him you knew exactly how this works." She set the transcript on the hood of the nearest Suburban with a precise final motion. "That you had been doing this your whole life." The street was very quiet. Earl Pruitt still standing near his tow truck with the expression of a man who is attempting to be invisible and understands that he is not succeeding. Said because he was at his core, a man who believed in being honest when the alternative was allowing something false to stand uncorrected. "I told him this looked federal. I asked him if he was sure." He said it to no one in particular, into the middle distance as though reporting a weather condition. "He told me to hook it up." Vargas glanced at Earl, then back at Doyle. "Even the civilian contractor had better instincts than you." It was at this moment that Captain Harlan Doyle arrived through the FBI perimeter in his unmarked car, captain's bars on his collar. 30 years of decorated service walking in with him, in the way that 30 years of anything walks with a person as posture and economy of movement, and the capacity to read a situation with the speed that only long practice produces. He read this one in under 10 seconds. His eyes moved the federal vehicles, the agents, his son standing with his hands at his sides, and his face doing what faces do when everything has gone wrong. And then to Coleman's badge still in Coleman's hand, and then to the tow truck with the charger chained on the flatbed. And then Harlan Doyle went still in the way that large, capable men go still when they have understood something they did not want to understand and have understood it completely. He did not go to his son. He went to Vargas because he was a professional, and because going to his son was not what the situation required, and because he did not in that moment trust what would happen if he stood next to Marcus. He identified himself. He asked in a voice that had already absorbed the answer what had happened. Vargas told him with the professional precision of one commander briefing another 18 months of deep cover work. The final meeting of the Disciples of Chaos leadership, the distribution network across 5 states, the supplier connections worth documenting, and then the tow truck request that had ended it. "Your son scared them all away," she said. "All primary subjects are in the wind." Harlan turned and looked at his son. Marcus was watching him with the specific attention he had been watching him with for his entire life, waiting for the thing that said, "Good job. You got it right. You did what I would have done." And Harlan looked at his son's face, at the hope still living in it, despite everything, and felt something move through him that was not anger and was not disappointment, but was something quieter and more permanent than either. "You were taught better than this," Harlan said, very quietly, the weight of 30 years in every syllable. "I was trying to make you proud," Marcus said. "You were trying to make yourself proud," Harlan said, "and you just destroyed everything." He turned away. He could not look at his son anymore. His back straight, with military habit for 30 years, began its slow, visible collapse, the posture of a man whose load-bearing structure has given way, settling into something smaller and more honest than the shape he had maintained all his life. Vargas returned to Doyle with her credentials in her hand, and her voice carrying the flat, formal weight of procedure applied to consequence, not anger, not satisfaction. Simply the law doing what the law does when someone has broken it in a way that is documented, witnessed, and not open to interpretation. "Officer Marcus Doyle," she said, "you are being detained for federal obstruction of justice under Title 18, Section 1519, and for deprivation of rights under color of law. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a federal court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed." She nodded to the 2 agents flanking her. They produced zip-tie restraints, not handcuffs. Zip-ties, the restraints reserved for suspects rather than officers, a distinction that registered on every CPD face in the perimeter, with the specific uncomfortable clarity of a line being crossed that they had not previously imagined could be crossed. At least not like this. Not here. Not today. "Dad!" The word came out of Doyle at a register lower than his speaking voice, the voice of someone who has run out of every other option and is reaching for the last one, the oldest one, the one that has always worked before. He was looking at his father's back. Harlan had not turned. "Dad, I don't—" Harlan raised one hand, palm out, without turning around. The gesture said everything that words would have taken too long to say in the specific economy of a man who has spent 30 years saying difficult things in fewer words than the difficulty required. The agent secured Doyle's wrists. The plastic ratcheted tight with a sharp mechanical sound that was the loudest thing on the street for the moment. It lasted, that sound of restraint applied to someone who had spent 5 months of his life applying it to others without, until this moment, having been required to understand what it felt like from the other side. They walked him to the Suburban. He moved with the shuffling, half-present gait of a man whose body is following instructions, while his mind is still somewhere else, still on the sidewalk, still circling the charger, still certain, still composing the story he was going to tell at the bar tonight. At the vehicle's door, he turned his head one last time, looking for his father, needing his father to turn around and give him something. anger, disappointment, anything other than that. Back, that slowly collapsing back that was not turning. Harlan did not turn. Coleman stood 15 feet away and watched this family come apart in the cool October air with the particular combination of exhaustion and clarity that comes from having been right about something terrible. And he felt nothing that could be called satisfaction and nothing that could be called vindication. Because the operation was gone and 3 informants needed to be relocated before nightfall. And $50 million worth of fentanyl was back in distribution channels. And the only thing that had been accomplished this morning was the thorough destruction of Marcus Doyle's life and Marcus Doyle's father's legacy. And that was not a thing that felt like anything worth feeling good about. He reached up and pressed his hand against his left shoulder. The rotator cuff was still aching, the specific, familiar throb of a damage that had never fully healed, doing what it did in cold weather, marking the time and the cost. He was going to file the formal use of force complaint at his next debrief. The unnecessary contact, the excess pressure, the old injury activated by a hand that did not calibrate its force against the situation. It was a small thing, but it was documented. Everything got documented. That was how it was supposed to work, even when everything else didn't. Vargas approached Harlan with the professional courtesy of one commander who respects another commander's record, even when the record has been compromised by forces outside the commander's direct control. She told him his 30 years spoke for themselves. Harlan was quiet for a long moment. "Then he is my failure," he said. "I don't know exactly how I made him, but I made him." His voice was empty of everything except the truth of the statement. That's exactly what he is. He walked back to his car alone. The door closed behind him. The street was quiet in the specific way of streets where something irreversible has just happened and the city has not yet caught up to it. The FBI listening post 4 miles east smelled of stale coffee and the particular quality of air in rooms where people have been concentrating intensely for a long time, and the concentration has just ended badly, and Sac Vargas stood in front of the monitoring wall, every screen dark, every waveform flat, and walked her team through the damage with the same precision she gave everything because precision was the only useful thing available to her at this moment. 3 confidential informants needed to be relocated before midnight. Vargas made sure her team understood what that meant, not in the bureaucratic language of assets requiring relocation, which had a way of smoothing the human cost off things that deserved to carry it, but in plain terms. These were people with apartments, with neighbors who knew them, with children in local schools, with lives that had been constructed in specific places over specific years. They would be told this evening that everything was different, now that they needed to pack what they could carry and leave the rest, that the federal government would make them as whole as it could somewhere they had not planned to live. Their lives were being uprooted because Ghost's cover had been burned and because their association with Ghost was now potentially known to an organization that treated that kind of knowledge as an execution order. A field agent began calculating the fentanyl figure, and Vargas stopped him before he reached the number because some numbers do too much damage when they are spoken aloud in rooms full of people who need to keep working. Everyone already understood what $50 million worth of unimpeded fentanyl distribution across 5 states meant in terms of human cost. The number did not need to be stated to be real. Coleman sat at the end of the table and listened to all of it. He did not speak. He sat with his tan jacket folded over the back of the chair beside him and his earpiece on the table in front of him, removed, unnecessary, no longer connected to anything, and he looked at it with the particular attention you give to things that have just performed their last function. After the debrief closed and the room began to empty, Agent O.C.'s partner, a younger agent mid-20s with the careful awkwardness of someone who is not sure whether the question he wants to ask is appropriate, approached Coleman. "Are you okay, sir?" Coleman considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm tired," he said. "I've been someone else for 18 months, and now I'm just very tired." He went home, His apartment received him in the particular way of spaces that have been lived in intermittently, the neutral air, the absence of anything that required attention, the specific silence of a place that has been waiting without expectation. He hung the tan jacket over the kitchen chair. He stood in the middle of the room. He rotated his left shoulder twice, slowly feeling the familiar pull of the injury, the body's clock marking the cost of the morning. Then he sat down and let the silence settle around him and allowed himself for the first time in 18 months to simply exist as the person he was. In the 15th District break room, Sergeant Raymond Briggs watched the news coverage of the federal operation on the wall-mounted television, his coffee going cold in his hand, and recognized from the broadcast's description that the CPD officer involved was Doyle. He felt no guilt. Guilt requires the belief that you did something wrong, and Briggs had not arrived at that belief in 22 years, and was not going to arrive at it on a Tuesday afternoon. What he felt was something closer to professional annoyance, the specific irritation of a man who has handed someone a tool and watched them use it in a way that attracted attention to the tool, and by extension to the man who had been distributing it. He changed the channel. He refilled his coffee. He told himself and believed that this was not his problem. He was catastrophically wrong about that. 8 months later, the Dirksen Federal Building in downtown Chicago received you differently from the county courthouse. The mahogany walls absorbed sound rather than bouncing it back at you. The air conditioning hummed at a temperature that communicated precise intention rather than approximate functionality, and the federal seal behind the judge's bench communicated without subtlety and without apology that this was the room where accountability lived when every other room where accountability was supposed to live had declined to do its job. Marcus Doyle sat at the defense table in a gray suit that had come from a discount rack and fit badly across the shoulders he had been carrying since the academy, and the distance between the man in that suit and the recruiting poster rookie who had circled a Dodge Charger on West Madison Street 8 months ago was a distance that had been covered entirely on foot through federal detention and pretrial hearings and the slow, grinding accumulation of understanding what you have actually done. He had lost 20 pounds. The jaw was still set, that appeared to be structural, not learned, but now it read as desperate rather than certain, the set jaw of a man maintaining a shape that no longer has anything beneath it to maintain against. His attorney was court-appointed. The CPD union had reviewed the body camera footage, the footage from the camera on Doyle's own chest running throughout the entire stop recording everything, and had made the calculation with the cold arithmetic of institutions protecting themselves that defending Marcus Doyle was more expensive than cutting him loose. Doyle had assumed the protection would be there when he needed it. He had not been informed that the protection was conditional. 3 rows back in the gallery in khaki pants and a button-down shirt that carried no uniform and no rank, sat Captain Harlan Doyle. He looked older by more than 8 months. He had submitted his retirement papers 6 weeks after the incident. Family concerns, the paperwork said, and everyone in CPD who knew him understood what those words meant and what they did not mean, and chose not to press the distinction out of the specific mercy that institutions sometimes extend to men who have served them faithfully and been broken by something that was not entirely within their control and not entirely outside it either. He did not look at his son. He looked at the federal seal on the wall behind the judge's bench and held something very carefully in check. The gallery was full. Reporters in the rows closest to the aisle. Law enforcement from several agencies in the back, some there out of professional interest, and some out of the particular need that people have to witness the consequences of things they might have done differently themselves. Civilians who had watched the body cam footage leaked to the media within 72 hours of the incident, currently approaching 20 million views, enough times that they felt they had a stake in the outcome. The video that Doyle's own chest camera had recorded showed in high definition and without ambiguity, a well-dressed black man on a Chicago sidewalk, asking repeatedly and explicitly for supervisor verification. Asking calmly, professionally, without anger, without escalation, without any of the behaviors that Doyle's reports described him as exhibiting. And it showed Doyle dismissing each request with the specific, unhurried confidence of a man who has decided what the situation is and is not interested in information that might require him to reconsider. The comment sections had not been kind. The editorial boards had not been kind. The CPD Communications Office had issued a statement that managed to be simultaneously thorough and inadequate, as institutional statements about this kind of thing tend to be. Notably absent from the gallery Sergeant Raymond Briggs, because Briggs was not in this courtroom. He was in a courtroom 3 floors below in his own federal proceeding at his own defense table, a fact that Doyle had learned and turned over in his mind many times without yet arriving at a conclusion he was willing to name. AUS A. Sandra Croft called Special Agent Darius Coleman to the stand at 10:17 a.m., and the courtroom watched him walk down the center aisle with the attention that rooms reserve for people who have been through something significant and come out the other side carrying it visibly without being destroyed by it. He wore his FBI dress uniform, navy blue, gold-button service medals arranged with the precision of a man who understands that precision in this context is a form of respect for the occasion and for the people who need to understand what the occasion means. He moved with the quiet authority of someone who has stopped performing calm because calm has become his resting state, and he took the oath with his hand raised and his voice carrying clearly and his eyes level in the way of a man who is not afraid of being looked at. Osa Croft stood at the podium with a slim folder and the specific economy of a prosecutor who knows that drama is unnecessary when the facts are doing the dramatic work. Agent Coleman, please describe your assignment prior to the events of October 14th. Coleman's voice was steady and unhurried, the voice of a man testifying to facts he has lived, rather than performing facts he has prepared. I was assigned to a deep cover operation targeting the Disciples of Chaos, a fentanyl distribution network operating primarily across the Midwest. My role was to represent myself as a financial consultant specializing in money laundering. Over 18 months, I built relationships with mid-level distributors, earned their trust incrementally, and worked my way into the confidence of the organization's leadership. What did that assignment require of you personally? Coleman was quiet for a moment, not for effect, but for honesty, to give the answer the specific weight it carried. It required me to be someone else, completely and continuously for 18 months. I could not carry my credentials on my person. I could not contact my family in ways that might be traced. I was operating for most of that period without the ability to call for help, because calling for help would have ended the operation and likely ended my life. He paused. The organization I was infiltrating had killed 14 people we knew of. Informants, competitors, anyone they identified as a threat. Croft asked him to describe the scope of the operation. He did the 5 states, the $50 million, the cartel supplier connections the network built with the patience and care of an organization that intended to last. He described it plainly without melodrama in the language of a man who wants the people in front of him to understand the scale of what was at stake. On the morning of October 14th, Croft said, what was happening when Officer Doyle arrived at your location? The final meeting of the Disciples of Chaos leadership. They were confirming distribution routes, supplier contacts, payment structures. The meeting had been months in planning and was the culmination of the entire 18-month operation. We needed 1 more hour of recorded conversation, and we would have had everything necessary for a coordinated arrest of the entire network. 1 more hour. 1 more hour, Coleman confirmed. Everything we had built toward was happening across the street, and then Officer Doyle arrived. Croft asked him why he had not identified himself to Doyle. Coleman explained precisely, and without self-pity, the lookouts in the second-floor windows, the 3 informants whose lives depended on Ghost's cover, holding the 1.5 years of earned trust that would evaporate the moment federal credentials appeared on that sidewalk. He described the requests he had made to call the supervisor to run his name through federal channels, to call the field office directly. He described each dismissal with the same calm and precise language, and the jury listened with the focused attention of people understanding something that matters. "Agent Coleman," Croft said, "during the stop, Officer Doyle made physical contact with you. Can you describe that to—" Coleman's hand moved briefly to his left shoulder, a small involuntary gesture, the body's acknowledgement of the subject, and settled. He placed his hand on my left shoulder with force in excess of what the situation required to move me away from the vehicle. I have a pre-existing injury to that shoulder, a torn rotator cuff from a training accident at Quantico that never fully healed. The contact aggravated the injury significantly. Did you react? No, I was trained not to react under physical provocation during a cover operation. The discipline held. He said it without pride and without complaint as a statement of fact. But I noted the contact at the time. I filed a formal use of force complaint at my next debrief. The complaint is part of the federal record. He reached up very briefly and touched the shoulder. The gesture was small. The jury saw it. Several of them would remember it longer than most of what was said in the room that day. Croft asked about what was lost. Coleman's answer was precise and aimed at the jury without being performed at them. The operation, the 3 informants relocated at federal expense with their lives permanently disrupted the fentanyl back in distribution, and 18 months of a federal agent's life spent building something that a 5-month rookie destroyed in 40 minutes because he decided a well-dressed black man in that neighborhood could not possibly be what he said he was. And what was his reason for that conclusion as far as you could determine from your direct interaction with him? Coleman looked at the jury steadily. He told me directly. He said, "In this neighborhood, expensive means dirty." He said it twice. And when I continued to request verification, he told me he knew exactly how this works. A pause. He was 5 months on the force. He told a federal undercover agent who had spent 18 months in rooms with men who killed people for a living that he knew exactly how this works. Croft said nothing further and sat down. The courtroom was quiet in the way it gets when something has been said that does not need commentary. The cross-examination of Coleman by Doyle's court-appointed attorney lasted 11 minutes and accomplished in aggregate nothing except demonstrating with increasing clarity that the man conducting it had reviewed the evidence and understood that he was attempting to build a structure from materials that were not adequate to support it. He made 3 attempts an entrapment argument. Coleman dismissed with a single sentence, a challenge to the body. Cam footage's chain of custody that the forensic metadata had already answered, and a suggestion that Coleman's cover had been deteriorating before Doyle arrived, which Coleman addressed by noting that the cartel had trusted Ghost sufficiently to invite him into their most sensitive meeting, which is not the behavior of an organization uncertain about its financial consultant. The attorney sat down. He did not look relieved. Doyle took the stand over his attorney's documented objection because Marcus Doyle was 26 years old and believed still that if he could explain himself properly, the people in front of him would understand. He had not yet fully learned that a jury's job is not to understand him, but to understand what he did, and that understanding what he did was in this case not going to lead where he hoped. Ayuse Croft approached the podium with the unhurried confidence of a prosecutor who has prepared for this moment with more care than anyone on the other side of the room suspects. "Officer Doyle," she began, "you found Agent Coleman's behavior suspicious. Walk the jury through what specifically was suspicious." Doyle, with the careful delivery of a man who has rehearsed this, the vehicle modifications, the location outside a known gang headquarters, his demeanor. His demeanor, was he nervous? No, he was too calm. Croft let that sit. She looked at the jury for a moment, then back at Doyle. Too calm. So cooperation is suspicious. Requesting supervisor verification is suspicious. Remaining professional throughout a law enforcement stop is suspicious. She came around the podium, standing where both Doyle and the jury could see her clearly. Tell me, Officer Doyle, what would a federal agent have had to do to convince you he was legitimate? What specific behavior would not have been suspicious? Show me his badge. He couldn't, Croft said, with the flat certainty of a woman stating a fact that has already been established. Showing his badge would have gotten him killed. You know that now, but he gave you 3 other ways to verify his supervisor federal databases a direct phone number to the field office. You declined all 3. She paused. Why? Doyle opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it. I thought he was lying. Based on what evidence? The silence that followed was the kind that has texture, not empty, but full of the specific thing that everyone in the room is waiting to hear named, and that Doyle was not able to name because naming it required a kind of self-knowledge he had not yet developed. The neighborhood, Croft said. The car. Doyle looked at his hands. Croft walked to the evidence table and picked up the body cam transcript, the same printed page Vargas had read from on West Madison Street 8 months ago, and she held it in a way that said she was about to read from it, and the jury straightened almost imperceptibly. Officer Doyle, she said, on the morning of October 14th, you told Agent Coleman and I am reading directly from your own body camera recording. In this neighborhood, expensive means dirty, every single time. She looked up. You said this twice during the stop. You then told him again from your own recording that you knew exactly how this works, that you had been doing this your whole life. She set the transcript on the rail in front of the witness stand, facing Doyle so he could see his own words in print. You had been on the force for 5 months, she said. And you told a federal undercover agent who was asking you explicitly and repeatedly to verify his identity through official channels that you knew exactly how this works. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. The courtroom was so quiet that the air conditioning was audible. The man you dismissed as a drug dealer in a suit, she said, had spent 18 months in proximity to men who murdered people without hesitation, wearing that suit, speaking those words, building the case that you dismantled in 40 minutes. He asked you 6 times to verify. He begged you. She let the word land. And you told him you knew exactly how this works. She picked up the transcript. No further questions. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of 12 people carrying something they had just been handed, something that did not need to be explained further, because it had been explained precisely enough that further explanation would only dilute it. 3 rows back, Harlan Doyle pressed his hands flat against his thighs and stared at the wall behind the witness stand with the concentrated stillness of a man holding himself together through an act of sustained will that he was not sure he could maintain for much longer. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. The verdict was what everyone in the room had understood. From the moment Croft set that transcript on the rail, it was going to be guilty on the count of federal obstruction of justice, guilty on the count of deprivation of rights under color of law. Judge Miriam Aldridge had been on the federal bench for 19 years. And in 19 years, she had developed the specific quality of judicial authority that comes from having seen enough of what happens when power is held without accountability, that she was no longer capable of being surprised by it only consistently and without diminishment, troubled by the scale of the cost. She addressed Doyle before sentencing with the measured permanent gravity of a woman who understood that the words spoken in this room at this moment would be read and cited and referenced in ways she could not fully predict, and who therefore chose them with care. Mr. Doyle, she said, and she did not raise her voice because she did not need to. You were given a badge and a mandate to serve and protect the citizens of this city without distinction, and without the distortion of assumptions that you had not tested and had no basis for treating as facts. You failed at that mandate in a way that had consequences far beyond this courtroom. She looked at him steadily. You did not merely make a procedural error. You acted on a belief that a black man in an expensive car in a certain neighborhood could not possibly be what he said he was. And that belief cost 3 people their lives as they knew them, and left $50 million of poison flowing through the distribution networks of 5 states. She paused, and the pause had the weight of someone allowing a thing to be felt before continuing. "You made every honest officer in this city harder to trust," she said. "That is not a small thing. That may be the largest thing you destroyed." The sentence, 3 years federal. A $100,000 fine allocated by the court's specific order to the federal fund supporting the 3 relocated informants, each dollar traceable from Doyle's penalty directly to the people whose lives his decision had permanently altered. The pension benefits Doyle had accrued in 5 months on the force, modest but real, frozen and redirected to the same fund. And a permanent ban from law enforcement employment in any capacity, anywhere, supplemented by mandatory participation in the FBI's interagency training program, where his case would be taught, and his decisions would become the curriculum for every officer and recruit who came after him and needed to understand in specific and undeniable terms what it looked like when assumption overrode procedure. The fine going directly to the informants registered in the courtroom in a specific way. Several jurors nodded almost imperceptibly, the nod of people who had been waiting for something that matched the scale of what had been taken. The gavel came down, final and absolute. In the second row of the gallery, Coleman watched Doyle be led out. At the door, Doyle turned the reflexive human need to see what you are leaving, and their eyes met. Coleman did not look away. He did not nod. He did not offer anything, not absolution, not contempt, not the triumphant satisfaction that some people might have expected. He looked at Marcus Doyle, the way you look at something that cost you a great deal and taught you something you did not want to learn and cannot unlearn now, and he let the look be what it was. The door closed. Harlan Doyle stood from the gallery without looking toward the front of the room, without looking at the spot where his son had been standing, and walked to the exit with the careful pace of a man managing something that would destroy him if he let it move too fast. Coleman sat for a moment longer in the row he had occupied all morning. Then he put on his jacket, stood, and walked out into the November afternoon, into the cold air of a city that continued doing what cities do. Indifferent, continuous, carrying its millions of people forward without acknowledgement of what any particular morning had cost any particular person. He touched his shoulder briefly on the courthouse steps. Then he let his hand drop and kept walking. 3 weeks after Doyle's conviction in a federal courtroom, 3 floors below, the one where Doyle had stood, Sergeant Raymond Briggs sat at his own defense table in his own borrowed clothes and faced his own jury and his own federal prosecutor, and the 22 years that had defined him looked in this room very different from how they had looked in the 15th District break room. He was charged under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, built from 4 categories of evidence assembled over 6 months of investigation, that the Doyle incident had triggered body camera recordings from officers who had been under Briggs's supervision during stops that bore the specific fingerprints of his philosophy. Internal affairs complaint files that had been buried and then exhumed as part of the federal review. Financial records mapping a pattern of behavior across the precincts Briggs had worked, and the testimony of 3 officers who had accepted plea deals in exchange for their cooperation. The blue wall, when it contemplates federal sentencing guidelines, develops cracks that were not previously visible. Those 3 officers described in time-stamped and specific detail the break room sessions, the unofficial briefings that never appeared in any training record where Briggs had translated his operating theory into practice. They described him teaching rookies that expensive meant dirty, and that calm meant guilty, and that verification was for officers who weren't sure of what their eyes were telling them, and that Briggs was always sure, and that the officers who stayed in his unit should aspire to be equally sure. They described how that theory translated into stops and arrests, and a pattern that the evidence showed was not professional instinct, but something much more specific and much harder to defend in a federal courtroom. Briggs's attorney argued that he had been operating within the parameters of department culture as he understood it, that the gap between what Briggs had done and what the law prohibited was narrow and contested and insufficient to support a federal conviction. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned a verdict that suggested the gap was neither narrow nor contested. At sentencing, Judge Warren Ellison addressed Briggs with the deliberate precision of someone who intended the words to be part of the permanent record. "You did not act alone," Judge Ellison said, "and that is the most damning thing about you. The officers you trained did not become what they became in a vacuum. You built the conditions. You cultivated the attitudes. You handed them a philosophy that you presented as experience, and that was in fact prejudice wearing the costume of knowledge. And then you protected the results for 22 years by ensuring that the complaints filed against you and against the officers you trained never reached anyone who might have stopped it." He looked at Briggs steadily. "The fact that you were never held accountable for 22 years does not mean those years did not happen. It means the accounting was delayed." Sentence 5 years federal. Permanent revocation of his law enforcement certification. Civil liability exposure, which the judge noted with particular precision to every individual who could demonstrate that Briggs's training had contributed to an unlawful stop or arrest, a category that the Federal Civil Rights Division had indicated would be the subject of ongoing investigation. Briggs left the courtroom in the custody of federal marshals, the permanent flush on his face unchanged because some things run deep enough that consequence does not reach them quickly, and the process of understanding what you have built out of the materials of your own unexamined certainty takes longer than a single sentencing hearing to begin. Coleman was not in the courtroom for Briggs's sentencing. He was at the FBI field office on the north side writing curriculum. His assistant slid a brief across his desk that afternoon. Briggs convicted, sentenced, remanded. Coleman read it. He set it in the outbox. He rotated his shoulder, once felt the familiar ache, let it go. Then he turned back to what he was writing, because what he was writing was the point, and the point was the work that came after. 1 year after October 14th, Special Agent Darius Coleman stood on West Madison Street in the early morning in jeans and a dark jacket, the clothes of a man who is somewhere because he chose to be, rather than because an operation required him to be. He had driven here without calling it anything, without a plan for what he would do when he arrived. Some returns do not require justification. The building across the street had plywood over its windows, and a city work order notice stapled to the door, weathered by 3 months of rain until the print was mostly illegible, though Coleman knew what it said because he had filed the paperwork that triggered it. The disciples of chaos had scattered after Ghost was burned, not dissolved because organizations built on the economics of addiction do not dissolve. They reorganize and rebuild with the patient adaptive persistence of things that have learned to survive disruption. But this particular node was dark and boarded and emptied of whatever it had been for the 18 months he had watched it from across the street. What the FBI had managed to recover the satellite uplink had been uploading continuously until the winch jolt killed it, which meant the servers held 2 full hours of the final meeting's audio. Not the confirmation of the supplier name, not the finalization of the distribution routes, but enough. Terrence Cash Monroe had been arrested in Indianapolis 6 months after the operation collapsed, charged on the basis of those 2 hours. He was awaiting trial. Diego Blade Ruiz had been picked up at the Mexican border. His travel patterns flagged by intelligence Coleman's team had built from the partial record they preserved. Marcus Reaper Vance was still free, which was the part that Coleman had not resolved and did not expect to resolve quickly or cleanly, because men who had survived 12 years of federal investigation were built for exactly this, for outlasting the structures built against them and rebuilding in the ruins. This was not a complete victory. Complete victories were a category that existed mostly in the summaries written after the fact, and the actual work was always partial and ongoing and costly in ways that did not appear on any final accounting. He rotated his left shoulder twice. The old injury ached in the cool morning air, marking the time and the cost, the way it always marked them with the patient, reliable discomfort of a wound that had been noted and filed and was still being paid. He had come to treat it as information rather than complaint, the body's way of keeping a record that the mind was sometimes too occupied to maintain. He stood for 3 minutes. He watched the street do what streets do, carry people forward, indifferent and continuous, full of morning routines and destinations, and the particular energy of a city that does not stop for any particular thing. A woman walked past with a bag of groceries. A teenager on a bicycle swerved around a pothole with practiced ease. A man in a construction vest stopped at the corner, looked at his phone, kept walking. Then Coleman walked back to his car. He had a 9 a.m. meeting at Quantico. The main auditorium at the FBI Training Academy in Quantico held 300 people when it was full, and on the morning Darius Coleman stood at the front of it. It was full new recruits in the tiered seating, with the attentive focus of people who understand that what they learn here will matter in ways they cannot yet fully predict, and police officers from departments across the country in the back rows present, because the protocol that bore Coleman's name had been incorporated into mandatory joint training for every department receiving federal grant funding. On the screen behind him, the Coleman Protocol. 3 provisions in plain language. The plain language of things that had been distilled from the painful complexity of what made them necessary. Mandatory supervisor verification within 10 minutes of any contact with an individual claiming federal affiliation. Cross-database checking beyond license plates through federal systems before conclusions about identity are treated as final. Automatic supervisory review triggered any time a subject's verification request is declined or ignored during a stop. It existed because of one traffic stop on one October morning on West Madison Street, and it would. Coleman believed this without sentimentality. The way you believe things that are supported by evidence prevent others because a well-documented failure treated with enough seriousness becomes protection for everyone who comes after it. He taught the class without performance, without the self-consciousness of a man telling a story about himself and aware of how it sounds. He told them what happened. He showed them the body cam footage unclassified for training purposes watched now in rooms like this one across the country. He let them watch each wrong choice be made in real time in high definition by a young officer who believed he was doing something correct. A hand from the police section, a young white officer in his late 20s with the specific quality of attention of someone who is not just taking notes, but locating himself in the story. What should he have done differently? Where was the exit? Coleman said, "The moment I asked him to call his supervisor, that was the exit. Available from the beginning, available throughout, never taken. Because criminals do not ask officers to call their supervisors. Criminals do not offer direct phone numbers to FBI field offices. Criminals do not request federal database verification of their identity." The request itself was the evidence, and he could not hear it because he had already decided what he was looking at. A second question from an FBI recruit in the center section. A young black woman whose notebook was filled with the close, precise handwriting of someone who takes notes as a form of commitment. "Are you angry at him?" Coleman considered this honestly, the way he had been considering it for a year. "I was. For a long time, anger was one of the clearest things I felt about that morning. But anger doesn't put dealers in prison. Anger doesn't protect communities from fentanyl. Training does. Protocol does. Holding the institution accountable when it fails does." He looked out at the room, at the faces, some young, some not all paying attention. "You are in this room because of what happened on West Madison Street. Every one of you. That is not nothing. That is in a way I did not plan for and did not want the thing that came out of it." At the back of the room, the young woman with the precise handwriting had stopped writing and was simply listening. Her pen still, her focus total with the expression of someone who has moved from taking notes to making a decision. Coleman noticed her. He did not know her name yet. He would. That was always how it worked. That was always the point. If this story moved you, if you believe that accountability is worth fighting for, and that justice, when it finally arrives, is worth witnessing, please subscribe to our channel and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. In a federal correctional facility in Indiana, in the particular stillness of the hour after dinner, when the noise of the cell block settles into its own rhythm, and the quiet becomes the kind you can almost rest inside. Marcus Doyle sat at the small desk in his 8x10 cell and wrote in longhand on prison issue paper. He had been writing the same document for 3 weeks. Not a letter, not an appeal, not a complaint, but an account. Every decision he had made on the morning of October 14th in sequence, from the moment he saw the Charger through his binoculars to the moment the SUVs boxed the intersection, and he understood for the first time and completely what he had been looking at. Every point at which the exit had been available and he had not taken it. Every time Coleman's voice had offered him a door and he had decided the door was a trap because that was what he had been taught, and he had not yet learned when he was taught it. How to tell the difference between a teacher giving you wisdom and a teacher giving you their damage. He was learning it now in the only classroom available to him, which was the 8x10 cell and the desk and the prison issue paper and the long hours of nothing but himself and what he had done. At the top of the page he had written the line that kept returning to him in the dark, the line he had said with such ease on a Chicago sidewalk on a Tuesday morning, believing it, absolutely meaning it, without malice, in a way that had always seemed like an excuse until he was alone enough and honest enough to understand that it was not. In this neighborhood, expensive means dirty, and beneath it in smaller letters, written after a long pause on the night he finally understood the full size of what those words had cost, the only correction available to him. Now, I was wrong. On West Madison Street on a Tuesday morning in late October, exactly 1 year after everything fell apart, the city went about its business with the generous, continuous indifference of a thing that belongs to everyone and waits for no one. A city crew had installed a new bus shelter in the exact spot where the no parking zone used to be, clean plastic panels, a route map that had not yet been marked or defaced, a bench that did not wobble. A woman in a business suit sat on the bench with a portfolio of documents on her lap, reading carefully, her coffee in a travel mug beside her. A patrol officer came around the corner on his morning rounds, walking with the unhurried, attentive pace of someone doing his job because it is worth doing well. He glanced at her. She glanced at him. He nodded, brief, professional, the acknowledgement of two people occupying the same public space with equal right to be there, and kept walking without breaking stride, without slowing, without anything other than the simple, clean courtesy of a man who sees a person where some of his predecessors had seen only a category. She watched him go. Then she looked back at her documents. The bus came. She got on. The street continued without her, and the morning continued without the street, and somewhere in the movement of all of it was the particular difficult thing that cities do when they have been broken and repaired and broken again, and are still somehow full of people going somewhere, still carrying the weight of everything that has happened in them and still moving forward. That evening, Darius Coleman sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him and a letter in his hands that had come through the Bureau's protected routing system. No return address. The handwriting careful and deliberate in the way of someone who has thought carefully about how to write a particular person's name. One of the 3 relocated informants. He did not know which one, and the routing system was designed so that he could not know which was the point and the protection. He had opened it this time, unlike the previous month's envelope, which he had held for 2 days before opening and then held for another hour before reading. The letter was short. It said in careful and considered sentences that the writer was in a new place, that the new place was different from the old place in ways that were still strange, and would probably remain strange for a long time, and that they wanted him to know that they understood what he had tried to do on October 14th, and that they did not hold what happened against him. They said this without elaboration, without drama, with the plain and specific generosity of someone who has thought carefully about what they want to say, and has said exactly that and no more. Coleman read it twice. He set it down on the table. He sat with his hands flat on the surface of the table, and the cold coffee in front of him, and the letter between his hands and outside his kitchen window. Chicago continued low and constant and indifferent and alive, carrying its millions of people through another evening, without knowing or caring what any particular kitchen contained. He sat there for a long time. He did not need to go anywhere. He did not need to do anything. He just sat with the letter and the coffee and the city and let the evening do what evenings do close.